Hi everyone. So for this week in AGP, I would like to introduce you to Hercule Poirot, who is a very famous fictional detective, one of the most famous detectives created by Agatha Christie. So she was actually a very prolific writer and created several different famous detectives, but he is probably the most famous of her creations, or at least one of. But he is a quirky fellow. I don't know if you know much about him, but he comes from Belgium, which is a country where they speak French, but they are not French, and they're very adamantly Belgian. So, yeah, like the waffles. So, they are people who were very much impacted by World War One. And so, as Agatha Christie is writing after World War One, she's British. She lives in England. You learned a little bit about her previously. And he is a refugee. He comes to England as a refugee after World War One to resettle. He was part of the police force in Belgium, but when he comes to England, he decides to become a private detective. So he and his friend, who's also kind of like a sometimes roommate, like house flatmate, Captain Hastings, who is a veteran of World War One, both kind of work together to solve crimes. Now, Captain Hastings is very different than Dr. Watson, but I think that you will see some interesting things about their pairing. So, this idea of the detective and the sidekick evolves from Poe and Conan Doyle, but Christie takes it in a very different kind of direction. Poirot is definitely very intellectual, very genius like. He connects dots that people cannot see, just like Sherlock Holmes. But he's quirky and differently so than Holmes. Holmes is very much an Englishman. Poirot's very much an outsider. He has trouble connecting sometimes with the English because he has an accent. People sometimes are prejudiced against him because they, feel like he's an outsider. He's an immigrant. And so for Poirot, Hastings sometimes bridges those gaps. But Hastings is, like I said, not Dr. Watson. He can be actually quite funny. There's an element of humor in watching Hastings try to connect the dots, and certainly Poirot finds it very humorous. He thinks that Hastings is adorably trying, but not always very successful at solving crimes. I've included for you this week some facts about Hercule Poirot that I think you'll find very interesting and helpful as you get to know him, and also a movie link. So, David Suchet created this character on film in a series of productions for PBS and the BBC. So, he has created all of the Agatha Christie stories about Poirot as either feature length films or short episodes, and they're all available online. So I thought I would link that for you, just one, which is one of my favorites called The Dream. There's definitely a very distinct feeling to this story. It captures a lot of the feelings of the 1930s or late 1920s. But also, there's a lot of emphasis on things like psychology, which is a huge feature in Agatha Christie's writing about Poirot. He's a fan of psychology, and that's kind of an emerging science of that time period. So I hope that you enjoy The Dream. It's full of twists and turns. And then next week is our last week, so we'll talk a little bit more about Hercule Poirot and Agatha Christie and start to wrap up our work on our stories. So use this as kind of something to think about as we prepare to write next week. All right, guys, I'll see you soon. Have a great week. Enjoy the story.